Very honored today to have one of those fighters and true champions of healthcare reform, Congressman Anthony Weiner. He's a person who never shies from a fight, often leads the fights on behalf of progressive values, whether it's 9/11 workers or healthcare reform or defunding basic benefits for the American people. He's been a champion for these issues throughout his service and has been a champion for healthcare reform. And for that, we're very grateful and we're very honored to have him. Congressman Weiner.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Neera, and thank you to the Center for American Progress for hosting us. This is indeed the one-year anniversary of healthcare reform, and I am thrilled to be here. If you are busy or if you have some time later, I'll also be doing a Twitter town hall meeting at 2:30, a Facebook town hall meeting at 3:30, a live chat on Daily Kos, and something called Reddit at 5:30. So if you missed these remarks, I'll be perfecting them there later. And this is indeed a great day, I think, for us to go back and take a look at the health care bill again, reflect on it again, do another discussion about what's been going on in the last year. It took a long time for us to get this passed. When I had my first town hall meeting on health care reform, I was 6'4", 220. This is all that's left of me after 22 town hall meetings, 70 hours of markups and hearings. You know, I think that there has been this exaggerated sense that was frequently from that was expressed by, rather inartfully, by Nancy Pelosi in a widely misquoted thing that she said, that there was this presumption that after 6 months of pitched debate and back and forth, once the law became a reality and people could then see it on a piece of paper and the policies would then start to take shape and we'd start to see people in our communities that benefited from health care reform, it would be harder to make up stuff about the bill, harder to lie about the bill. That turned out surprisingly not to be the case. A year later, a year after pen to paper by the President of the United States, a year now that people can actually see what's in the bill and what's not in the bill, there is still this widespread and frankly quite sophisticated and well done campaign by Republicans and opponents of the bill, many of them sponsored by the healthcare industry, to make up things about the bill, to continue the mistrust that goes into it. Now, I think to some degree, we Democrats and progressives, we sometimes have this fidelity to process and words and laws that we sometimes don't realize that it's not enough just to say, here's this great bill, here's the good thing that it's doing, and then we're off to the races. I think we haven't done a particularly skillful job in the last year of rebutting some of the basic thrusts of the Republican opposition to the bill. And thankfully, the Republicans have given us another bite at the apple by coming to Washington after campaign 2010 with an agenda built entirely on the things that they're against, and the chief among them being the health care bill. They've come to Washington to say, let's repeal and replace this bill. Every day we've had hearings and some other vote on some element of defunding or eliminating the health care bill. They've put an enormous amount of stock in having portions of it ruled unconstitutional. Now, some of the hiding under the desk wing of the Democratic Party are chagrined at this. I, on the other hand, and I think the Center for American Progress has imbued this as well, we welcome this. This is like a second opportunity for us to make the case and to explain to people the separation between wheat and chaff here. So what I'd like to do today is, since there's going to be a lot of opportunities where people are going to be doing summaries of what's in the bill, I want to try to take some of those basic Republican thrusts that I don't think we've done a very good job at confronting head on, and I think this includes the White House, hasn't done a particularly good job, and just trying to take them down a notch and to try to explain why, at the end of the day, they are not only not valid, but in many cases deeply hypocritical. You know, the first thing that has been said about the bill, and to some degree we who sponsored the bill and worked on it bought into this, was this notion that what we had done to health care was this giant transformative thing. In fact, it wasn't. In fact, for many Americans who have health care at their workplace, they're still going to get treated like crap by their health insurance company. They're still going to have very little control over how high their rates go. They're still going to have very few choices that they're going to have. That still is going to exist. I would have liked to have done more transformative things and made those things more difficult, but out of a deep sense going into this, that we wanted to try to find a compromise between the people who were like me, who said let's double down on the employer-based model, double down on the single-payer government the government model as Medicare, which essentially takes money from taxpayers and then gives it to doctors and doesn't take very much in overhead and takes nothing in profits, and the employer-based model. So this effort was made to, essentially double down on the employer-based model. So there were great pains that were gone into by the sponsors and by those of us who supported the bill, not to completely disrupt the marketplace of people that already have health care. So the one thing that is said, that is most commonly said, is that health care was completely transformed. In fact, it wasn't. Now, for those that are uninsured, it is going to be a dramatic improvement. They're going to have a place that they're going to be able to go. For small businesses that are trying to want to do the right thing, provide health care for their workers, enormous benefits. But this notion that the entire health care infrastructure got turned upon its head a year ago today simply is mythological. There are things that were changed, but not nearly as many people in America wanted. If you look at many of the polls that say what wound up happening, are you satisfied? If you drill into those that are dissatisfied, you find out that many of them wanted a much bigger change because they found out that, frankly, their benefits were not going to improve that much. The next we hear Republicans say is similar to the first, that there's big government takeover of health care. No. In fact, this is the opposite. When people use words like socialization to describe what is happening, government takeover, this is actually the polar opposite. We are taking taxpayer dollars and giving them to private companies, to private insurance companies. It's the opposite of socialization. And in fact, even if we would have done what I wanted, which is expand Medicare to more Americans, that wouldn't have been a government takeover of anything either, because it's still private doctors, private hospital, private clinics. So the idea that socialization or something like that is happening, it's quite the opposite. Well, again, we went to great length in this law to empower people to get private health insurance policies. The third we hear is, and it was particularly interesting to have governors come to Washington and complain about the plan, although they were governors with political interests like Haley Barbour, but come to Washington and say, you're trampling on our rights as states. Well, if you look at how the bill is structured, the exchanges, we gave the states every right to administer exchanges, and I think even the most anti-healthcare governor is going to say, yeah, we want our state to govern the exchanges. We hear Republicans complaining that there's not tort reform. Oh, hi, Huma. It's my wife, Huma Abedin. Apparently there's peace in the world, so she's able to stop by. We took should I start at the top for Huma? No. She'll be one of the people on Reddit later asking me questions. The decision not to include a broader tort reform and limit on torts in the federal law, something the Republicans bitterly complain about today, was a hat tip to the idea that that's the province of the state legislatures. Furthermore, there's not a body of tort law that governs things like malpractice. And so the idea that there's this big government takeover and trumping states' rights is, of course, not the case. And finally, we've heard many governors complain about provisions of the law that expand Medicaid eligibility between now and 2018, saying you're going to bankrupt the states. What they fail to point out is in that period of time, yes, more people are going to be covered under Medicaid, but are going to be paid for entirely with federal dollars, resulting in what should be a dramatic savings for the states. Now, there is a scenario in 2019 that states have to pay a lot more, but that's only if you govern your state very poorly. Because if you think about it, the expansion of Medicaid still means you'd have to have an enormous number of poor people for this not to be a good deal for your state. It's funny to listen to Haley Barbour come to Washington and say, oh, you're going to bankrupt my state. If you take that argument to its logical extension, he's stipulating to the fact there's going to be an enormous number of poor people in the future in his state. And it's also further ironic to hear the governor of Mississippi, which has the most generous reimbursement rate of any Medicaid state, complaining at all about anything the federal government. They get close to an 80% reimbursement on their Medicaid expenses compared to a 50% in New York State. So far be it for me to complain about Haley Barbour, and I hate to punch down, but still I do believe that, that the complaints about trumping states' rights are simply not true. Today we saw an article in the USA Today by Congressman Graves, who's the chairman of the Small Business Committee, talking about the burdens to small business. In fact, there are none. I mean, well, that's not true. This 1099 provision that the Senate put in that there's consensus in this town to do away with is the only new regulation, tax, fee burden put on small businesses. On the other hand, in this law, are going to make it 30% cheaper for any small business to offer health insurance to its workers. And in the future, we're going to allow those small businesses to go into this exchange where there's going to be competition to hold down prices. We're going to offer small businesses, for the first time ever, the opportunity to get subsidies to purchase health insurance for their workers. So if anything, we now have Republicans complaining bitterly about one of the largest tax cuts for small business in American history. The idea that somehow small business is being burdened by this law, quite the opposite. Now, we hope that small business takes these incentives to go out and buy insurance for their workers, because it is simply unfair, to be honest with you, to have a shoe store on one side of Queens Boulevard that makes the decision to offer health insurance, competing against one on the other side of Queens Boulevard which doesn't. Because the fact is that those costs are getting passed along one way or the other. The way we chose to solve that problem is to offer heavy incentives for all small businesses to offer insurance to their workers. Another common cry that we've heard from the Republicans is the notion that this is going to bankrupt the federal government. Now, we could have a conversation that can dominate this forum on how the CBO score was done, how its 10-year projection and 20-year projections, both of which show this is going to be a dramatic reduction in the national debt and deficits. But what I would prefer we focus on for a moment is an element of this discussion that has not come up in this conversation about costs. You know, the cost to the federal government is only one of the costs that we have to deal with when dealing with health care. We also have the cost to localities and local taxpayers when uninsured people walk into hospital emergency rooms without care. In New York City, we pay $8 billion in taxes, $8 billion in taxes each and every year for the uninsured and the underinsured. That doesn't even count to the social cost of the fact that we have 17 fewer hospitals in New York City since the year 2000. That shows up in no CBO score. It shows up in none of the debate that we've had here in Washington about the cost of this bill. Frankly, there is a transfer from local taxpayers, from state taxpayers, to the federal government in this bill. And even with that transfer, it winds up being a net savings of $1.2 trillion over 20 years. Now, I want to also point out that when we have this conversation about costs and what's bankrupting, one of the things that the CBO gives zero credit for is a lot of the incentives built into the bill for preventative care. Now, we know intuitively, and we also know because our mothers told us, that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The propeller heads at CBO don't see it that way. They give us no credit for doing things that virtually everyone agrees in medicine and everyone agrees in common sense and business, that if you do some things like we do in the Medicare, on the Medicare side of the bill, where we cover preventative services 100% without a single copayment, that you're going to incentivize people to get those preventative services. The conversations that we're going to be having about incentivizing in years to come primary care physicians by increasing the reimbursement rates in Medicare and Medicaid for primary care physicians to get more people in the front end of the health care structure than the later end. None of those savings are included in the bill, so I think that if anything, the cost as articulated by the CBO score are very, very conservative, that in fact the savings are going to be much higher. And if you start adding in the savings to state and local taxpayers, you're going to see the number increase even more. And finally, there is this issue of the mandate. This is perhaps dominated more conversation than it really deserves. First of all, the philosophy behind the mandate is one that I think that most Americans understand. The idea that people have to bear some responsibility in this transaction for their own care. People have to be, if we offer them incentives, if we offer them subsidies, that ultimately they have to accept responsibility for their own health care decisions in as much as they impact everyone else. You know, there's a basic element of legal thinking that, you know, the right of my fist ends at your nose. I can do what I like. But when I start to impact your rights as an American, your rights as a citizen, then there's reasonable place for government to come in and set those rules of the road. Well, when it comes to health care, people that choose not to get insurance, choose to be uninsured, are making a decision that has only two branches on the decision tree. One is to be perpetually healthy, and the other is to pass along the expenses of health care to someone else. Because as much as we may think we're ready, the sheer expense of being hit by a bus is pretty high. And when you can't pay it, it gets passed along to hospitals, it gets passed along to fellow citizens. So the mandate is something that was included in Romney Care. It's included in the bill that the president signed a year ago today. But it ain't that big a deal. In Massachusetts, which again it's a similar model. I'm going to enjoy watching Governor Romney debate himself during campaign 2012. But it's a similar model that we basically said, here's your subsidy, here's a system to be able to shop for health care more efficiently. Now you got to get it. A number of people that, given that structure, which is the same in this bill, that chose not to get it in Massachusetts was 0.067%, meaning virtually everybody, and this should come as no surprise to anyone who takes a step back from the political debate and just thinks the way most people think. People want health care. They want health insurance. They want their family to be protected. They want to have that peace of mind. But if lightning strikes, and it turns out that, as many of us believe, the Supreme Court turns out to be a third political branch of government, and they strike down the mandate, big deal. Big deal. First of all, I believe that, as many of you know, and not to get off on a tangent, but I believe that it's pretty clear that Justice Thomas clearly should recuse himself from these decisions, given the amount of money he's gotten from organizations that are dedicated to overturning health care reform. But putting that aside, we pretty much see the direction the Supreme Court is going, although I think that it would be folly to strike it down, and I believe that this is clearly under the province of the Commerce Clause. It's a relatively small number of people. And by the way, the solution, if the mandate is struck down, is not that the bill falls like a house of cards. People aren't going to suddenly start cheering and saying, oh, I was going to sign up, now I'm not. The solution is going to be offering something that everyone agrees is constitutional, and that's the public option in the exchange. Because clearly that is constitutional. No one denies that. It would be because it would be akin to Medicare, Social Security, where we do require people to withhold money from their checks and go into those programs. So if you think about that list that I just read, and the brief, and I think I did each in a couple of minutes, the brief rebuttal, it doesn't change the fact that for millions and millions of Americans, they saw this first year not be as much about back and forth as if they wanted it. If they were a senior citizen, they got coverage for the donut hole. If they were a young family, if they were a 23 or 24-year-old person in a family, they were able to go onto their parents' health insurance plan. We know now that we're coming up on a couple of stages of the bill for the next couple of years. This next period is going to be very, very important. It's going to be the rulemaking that's going to go on. As with any big bill, it's going to have to go on here. And you're going to have an enormous amount of back and forth about the minimum standards in the bill. That's the next big fight. Every advocate for an illness is going to want coverage. Advocates for certain technologies are going to want a prejudice in the bill for their services. That's going to be tough, but it's going to be necessary. Then the third stage of the bill is the implementation of the exchanges, which is where the big stuff that we're trying to do in the bill, covering the uninsured, taking that burden off of states and off of individuals, that gets implemented, and people get to shop in those exchanges just the way members of Congress and federal employees can shop for their benefits. And then the final stage of the bill is all the Republicans who voted no going to ceremonies and going to town hall meetings where they're bragging about how great Obamacare is. And they have to bite their tongue for calling it Obamacare for the next 50 years. But I can tell you this. I don't anticipate that this fight will end. I think that we are in this dynamic now that synapses are facing in a certain direction on this bill, and I think we're going to continue to have debate. But we, Democrats, have only a couple of choices here. We can engage the debate, or we can not engage the debate. I think it would be folly to believe that it is going away, and it would be folly to believe that I am either. Thank you very much.